This Halloween, that witch will get what she always wanted. It was Halloween night 30 years ago, and I made the worst decision of my life. I just wanted to have fun with my friends, but instead, I played with fire, and I got burned. She comes back for me every year, and this year, I'm too tired to resist. Please understand, it was an accident. I promise it was an accident. I've gone nearly 30 years without speaking about that horrible night. The guilt and the pain have finally become too much, and I'm going to share my story before my time on this earth is over. In the weeks leading up to Halloween, my friend Dave and I went to one of the local bookstores in the area. We would go so much that the owner of the place even knew us by name. The store consisted of 4 massive rooms filled with bookshelves. There were literally books stacked from the floor to the ceiling. Every genre you could possibly imagine was in this store. The owner inherited the store from his father, who inherited it from his father. The place had local history, and we loved supporting it. Because the place was so old, it had books that were also very old. If you went down into the basement, you could browse books that were extremely old. The basement was inherently creepy. We didn't go down there a lot, but every now and then I would check it out. Sometimes you could find an awesome antique book for your collection down there. I don't know why, but for some reason, on this specific day, something inside me was calling me to the basement. Dave tried calling me because he was ready to cash out, but I didn't hear him at all. A few minutes passed, and Dave reluctantly joined me down there. He hated it in that basement. It always smelled. It was dirty, and he just didn't get a good vibe. He kept asking me if I was ready, but I kept telling him not yet. Moments later, I was just about to head upstairs, and then I saw something. Or, I guess more accurately, I felt something. On the wall next to the stairs, there was a little gap between the bookcase and the railing on the stairs. In the gap, there were some books that had fallen onto the ground. For some reason, I bent down to pick up the books, and while I was down on the ground, I noticed some strange leather-bound book that was concealed behind the bookcase. It was covered in a layer of dust, and it was clear that this book had not seen the light of day in a very long time. I shouted to Dave that there was a book jammed back there, and he told me to just leave it. I couldn't though. I started to yank on it, and eventually, the book started to budge, and before I knew it, I pulled it out. A huge cloud of dust dispersed throughout the basement. Something about this book was calling out to me. It didn't have a title or any writing on the side of the book. I started to flip through the pages and I was fascinated. I had never seen anything like it. It had what looked like sketches of weird images all throughout the book. As I continued to inspect the pages, I noticed that most of the writing was in another language. I started to read it out loud, and Dave yelled and knocked the book out of my hands. Yelling at me, he said, "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" Blissfully ignorant, I just shrugged and said that I had no idea. Dave said, "Well, I don't know either, but reading Latin from an ancient book you found buried in a basement is not something I want to mess around with." I laughed at Dave. At that time, I was an incredibly skeptical person, and I didn't buy into any of that stuff. Just to antagonize Dave, I said I was going to buy the book, even though he was begging me not to. When we got to the cash register, the owner looked confused and almost uneasy when I put the leather-bound book onto the counter. In a weirdly uneasy voice, he said, "I don't recognize this book. Where did you find it?" I told him where I found it, and without hesitation, he told me to just take the book. Dave was beside himself and tried pleading with me one last time to not take the book, but I didn't listen. I ignored him again and went to my car with the joy of getting something for free. Dave and the shop owner both looked like they had seen a ghost. In the days that followed, I told all of our friends about the strange book that I found practically buried in that basement. Most of our friends had a similar reaction. They said it was freaky, but pretty cool. The day before Halloween, I got home from work and found the book opened in the middle of my living room floor. I admit this freaked me out a bit, but I was convinced it could be explained by a rational explanation. I was just too lazy to think of what that explanation might be. The next night was Halloween, the worst night of my entire life. We all went to a Halloween costume party, and I told everyone about how I found the book on the floor of my house. Most thought I was just making it up, but Dave knew I wasn't kidding. He begged me to throw the book into the fire, but I continued to ignore every warning Dave gave me. When the party started to disperse and there were only a handful of us left, I decided to give everyone at the party a treat. I pulled the book from my bag. Dave begged me not to mess around, but I was pretending not to hear him. I shouted, "Does anyone dare me to read from the book?" I could tell everyone was apprehensive, especially Dave. I couldn't believe how scared and superstitious all of my friends were. In an act of defiance that still haunts me, I shouted, "Wow, you guys are seriously afraid? I'm gonna prove a point to all of you right now." I started to read the Latin on the page. Dave and my friends pleaded with me to stop, and I continued reading. It's hard to explain, but for some reason I couldn't be stopped even if I had wanted to. I had never spoken Latin before, and yet the words were coming out perfectly. Even the dialect of my voice changed. When I finished reading the last line, there was an uncomfortably long pause. An eerie silence hung in the air of the room. Then, that's when it happened. The lights all shut off and the door swung open. The crisp Halloween air punched us in the face. An unearthly sound could be heard outside. The screams of my friends filled the room as I still tried to put a rational spin on the situation. In all the chaos, Dave's voice could be heard when he said, "Who is that?" Everyone stopped yelling and looked out the doorway. With the glow of the moon behind her, a beautiful woman was standing there. A dirty white dress adorned her frail body. She was as still as a statue, and when I took a step toward the strange woman, she laughed and ran off into the night. The laugh sounded like a cackle. It was menacing and filled with dread. Dave slammed the door shut, and then immediately the lights turned back on. We all sat in disbelief. For the first time, I had that fleeting thought that I may have been responsible. As unplausible as that may be, what other explanation could there be? Dave scolded me. I tried to apologize and reason with him, but he was done listening to me, and I didn't blame him. He left and drove home right away. I helped clean up after the party. I decided to stop by Dave's house on my way home to make sure he was all right. It had been a few hours since he left the party by this time. When I pulled up to his house, I noticed that the door was wide open. I got out of the car and cautiously approached the front door. The inside looked relatively normal. I could hear footsteps upstairs. I shouted his name a few times and no response. The footsteps were erratic, almost like he was running around. I continued to shout his name and no response. I crept to his room and slowly budged open the door. Inside was the woman, not Dave. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, smiling. She looked up at me and started to cackle again, an evil and sinister laugh. Just thinking about it now is making my blood run cold. I started to shout for Dave, and the woman just kept laughing. I shouted at the woman, demanding to know where Dave was. Abruptly, the woman stood up and stopped laughing. She was looking at me and then started to run at me, and her mouth was no longer human. She had rows of jagged teeth like a shark, and a deep, guttural growl could be heard coming from her. I turned around and I ran. I ran home and I locked myself inside my bedroom. I could hear the woman all night, pacing around my house, cackling. Morning came and the woman was gone. But so was Dave. After that night, Dave was reported missing, and after a long investigation, they never found him. Today, he is still technically missing. I know the truth, though. Whatever evil presence I released on that Halloween night, it took Dave. I don't know what she did or where she put him, but I know it was her. How do I know? Because every year on Halloween, she comes back to my house. I can hear her cackling and pacing around my house, getting closer and closer every year. This year, I'm done hiding. This year, I will face her head on. After Halloween this year, I may no longer be on this planet. Please listen to my warning. I've tried burning the book dozens of times, and it doesn't burn. I buried it deep within the woods here in Massachusetts. If you ever happen to stumble upon this book by chance, do yourself a favor and bury it even deeper into the earth. Whatever evil witch is confined to those pages, she won't ever stop. Happy Halloween, my friends. This year, I'll finally rest.